I love Halloween. Everything about it. I love the colors, the pageantry, the horror, the gore. So I knew, even when I was just a little girl, that someday my wedding would be on Halloween. After all, what could be better? Marrying the man I love most in the world on the day I love the most? It was everything I could ever want. When I met Dominic 4 years ago, I knew that it was fate. We were at a Halloween party. I was dressed as Harley Quinn. He was the Joker. We spent that whole first night together like there was no one else in the world but us. I wanted to marry him by the following Halloween, but Nick wanted to wait. He said he still had to finish his residency and we needed to establish ourselves financially first. Nick was always cautious with money. I loved that about him. I told him I understood, but I never stopped planning for our perfect day. Every year, I would show him my plans and beg him to finally propose before Halloween passed again. But he would say we couldn't afford everything I wanted to do, that we needed to save for longer. So I waited and expanded on my plans. Nick became a surgeon. I finished my engineering degree, and last year, I thought the time was right before we would finally get married. But he still thought my plans were too extravagant. Too expensive. He said he had a lot of debt from medical school. I tried to convince him that we could just take out a loan. We could pay it back later. We had a massive fight. He criticized my spending habits, my investments. It didn't make sense to me. We both had good jobs. We were making good money. Why shouldn't I be a bit extravagant? What is money for if not having fun? And shouldn't our wedding be the best day of our lives? Besides that, my investments weren't reckless spending. They might be down right now, but that would turn around eventually. We didn't need to worry about money. He was just being stingy. We almost broke up that day, but in the end, we loved each other too much to split over nothing more than finances. We agreed to stay together, to work on our problems. But he still wasn't ready to get married. This year, there was finally no more reason to hesitate. I inherited a small fortune from my grandmother 8 months back, enough to cover the wedding and plenty more besides. With that, I finally convinced Nick it was time to tie the knot. Now, after years of careful planning, today was the day. My wedding day, my Halloween. It was going to be perfect. I arrived at the venue early to inspect the setup. I had prepared several of the main features myself, and I needed to make sure that everything was in place for the big event. I was going to make sure that this was a night to remember for everyone. The ceremony was being held in the center of a massive corn maze. Once dusk fell, costumed guests would start finding their way through the haunted maze, populated by actors in elaborate zombie makeup who would jump out and scare people as they found their way through. Once the guests cleared the maze, they would enter a clearing where the ceremony was going to take place, populated by a variety of animatronics, a ghost with a severed head, a vampire that lunged at passerbys with glinting teeth, and a 10-foot-tall skeleton that cackled madly with an unhinged jaw. But my piece de resistance was the Grim Reaper. He stood high above the table where the cake was going to be placed, a scythe glinting in his bony hands, black robes flowing to the ground where he seemed to hover, no obvious feet connecting him to the ground. You couldn't see his face inside the hood, but his flaming eyes glowed from the darkness, designed to track guests and raise his scythe menacingly as they passed the table. He had been a labor of love for me. I spent weeks on him before the wedding. I admired my handiwork, running my fingertip idly over the edge of the scythe. And as I did, I heard a small scream and a crash at the entrance to the maze. I looked up to find that the caterers had arrived and a young man had dropped a serving tray, flinching away from my vampire. As he knelt to collect it, the head caterer crossed the space towards me and I went over to greet them, sticking my finger in my mouth and sucking on the blood as I did. "You are late," I admonished, removing my finger from my mouth and wrapping it in a tissue. "Well, we had to find our way through the maze to get here, ma'am. Surely there's a back entrance to this place?" The caterer glanced around. "No, the maze is the only way in or out." Having a back door into this place would have shattered the illusion, compromised the integrity of my vision. We have to carry all our gear through the entire... This is what I am paying you for, I cut him off. Now you all have the paperwork in order, correct? You have made sure there is no possible cross-contamination? There's no need to worry. Everything was prepared in a peanut-free facility. We take allergies very seriously, ma'am. Good. The last thing I needed was for my throat to swell shut on my big day. Well, it'll be dusk soon, and the maze is very dimly lit, so you should probably hurry and bring your gear in. The man opened his mouth as if to say something, but seemed to think better of it, turning and leaving without a word. I smiled and turned my attention back to the decorations. I needed to go and change into my dress soon. I walked out of the maze to find Dominic waiting for me, his tuxedo torn and splashed with blood. You look spectacular, he whispered. Of course I do, I replied with a little grin. My gown had a black lace bodice that ended in a blood-red skirt that swirled around my ankles. I had never felt more beautiful. I wished I could wear it every day. A moan from behind interrupted Nick's first look. We both turned our heads to see zombies ambling out of the maze, practically on top of us. They groaned, reaching out their dirty hands for us. With a small scream, I turned and tried to run, but stumbled on my high heels. Nick grabbed my hand and helped me up, and then we ran across the field and up the aisle that had been left clear at the center. As we reached the altar, gasping for breath and casting frantic glances back towards the pursuing zombies as if in mortal fear, the crowd applauded from their seats and the officiant started the proceedings. The ceremony was beautiful. Everything went as I planned. Afterwards, the zombies herded the guests towards the dinner tables, and as we ate, the speeches began. My maid of honor, Lacey, rose, smoothing her torn skirt and touching the bloody wound on her throat to make sure that the makeup was still in place. It made her look even paler than she normally was, with dark circles under her eyes and chalky foundation covering her face. Natalie and I have been best friends for more than 15 years, and I knew from the moment that she met Dominic, they would be. She continued talking, but I wasn't really listening. I knew what she was saying anyway. I had written the speech for her. Instead, I watched Dominic, but he didn't return the favor. His eyes were fixed on Lacey, a small smile on his face. I didn't know why he needed to study her so closely. You would think he had seen enough of her already. My mind flashed back to the pictures on his phone. Her. In our bed. In our shower. On our kitchen table. I always knew they would be married someday. My closest friends in the world have found true love with each other, and I couldn't be happier for them, Lacey continued. I was surprised she could say that with a straight face after the other speech she gave this morning in Nick's car when he said he was picking his mother up from the airport. The bug I had planted had captured every moment of their conversation, though I hadn't listened to all of it. I hadn't the stomach for it or the time. As I watched Lacey drone on about our perfect love, all I could hear were her true thoughts from the recording. You don't have to do this, Dom. There's still time. Please, just call off the wedding. We can run away together. She had pleaded, her voice wavering. You know I can't do that, Lacey, Nick had replied. Why? Because of the money? She had spat that with true venom. If you think she'll share any portion of her inheritance with you, you're only kidding yourself. The way she spends, I would be surprised if it wasn't gone within a month to her crypto investments, her clothes, her trips, her gambling. You'll be in deeper debt than ever if you marry her. Cut your losses now. Walk away. I already considered that, Lacey. I have a plan. Just give me a little time. I will work this out, and then we can be together, all right? You know I love only you. The applause brought me back to the present, and I looked up to see Lacey returning to her seat, smiling and sipping her champagne. Nick's eyes followed her, lingering on her longer than they should have. He couldn't even pretend for one night. Nick wasn't particularly good at keeping secrets. I probably would have found out sooner if I hadn't been distracted with wedding planning. Their affair had been going for over a month, but I only figured it out 2 weeks ago. For a moment, I thought that all the work I had put into this was going to be for nothing. But I had spent so long planning. I couldn't just call it off. Even if I could have borne the humiliation, I couldn't just let Lacey win. I decided instead that I could work with this. It could even give me a way to improve the festivities, to make this a true Halloween wedding. It was almost time now. Almost time to give everyone a real show. The music blared through the field. I had kicked off my heels and changed into flats for dancing, and Nick and I spun across the dance floor, my blood-red skirt twirling around me. He dipped me low as the song ended, and then stepped back to catch his breath. I pulled him down for a deep, passionate kiss. I caught a brief glimpse of Lacey's irritated glare before she turned and disappeared into the crowd of costumed partygoers. I mopped a bead of sweat from my brow. "This is the happiest day of my life," Nick whispered into my ear. "Mine too," I smiled brightly. "I can't wait to get you home. Remember, I have a special present for you, so that we can have a private celebration, just us." I did remember. The box, professionally wrapped in colorful paper, had been on the kitchen table this morning when I left. I had wondered what was inside, but I had other things to worry about. I suppose I'd find out when I got home tonight. "Well, if you're eager to be alone, maybe it's time to cut the cake," I suggested. I had been anticipating that moment all day. I had designed the cake myself, drawing my own sketches for the baker to work from. I had tested 7 different bakeries before I found the one that could make it just the way I wanted. It was striking, attention-grabbing, the centerpiece of the evening. It had 6 tiers, done in a black lace pattern, with red icing dripping down the tiers like blood and black roses with eyeballs peering out from their centers, placed around the base. I looked across the dance floor, and there was a small crowd gathered beneath it, oohing and awing. All the while, they were followed by the watchful eyes of the Grim Reaper above. It was a real showstopper, exactly as I had planned. "Yes, I think it's time." Nick took my hands and led me over to the cake. When we arrived, I shooed away the curious onlookers, and 2 of my undead bridesmaids rushed over to help me clear the area. "Okay, Nick, sweetie, stand right there. I want the photographer to get perfect shots of this." I maneuvered him onto a discreet X, marking the spot on the ground. I raised my glass and tapped my fork on the edge, signaling for quiet. As people gathered around, held a reasonable distance back by my bridesmaids, I began. "Can I have your attention, everyone? I have something that I want to say to all of you. You see, the truth is..." I paused, gesturing for Nick to begin cutting the first slice of cake. As the knife pierced it, red liquid oozed from the cake, falling beneath it and dripping from the table onto the floor. The effect was better than I had hoped, drawing gasps from the crowd. I dipped a finger in and tasted it dramatically. Yum, strawberry. Everyone chuckled, and Nick resumed cutting. As he did, I searched for Lacey in the throng. Catching her eye, I winked, and she smiled back at me, working her way closer to the table. The truth is, I couldn't imagine a better evening than this, being here with all of you. Nick finished carving out a slice of the bleeding cake and held it up for everyone to appreciate. Then he turned to me, a devilish grin on his face, and pulled the cake back, moving to smash it into my face. I felt hands on my shoulders pushing me aside, harder than was strictly necessary, and I fell to the ground. Above, Lacey stood between me and Nick, face covered in gory red cake bits. I grinned. It was exactly as we had planned it. I had told her that Nick was planning to do a cake smash against my express wishes, I might add, and said that as my maid of honor, it was her job to protect me. We planned for her to dramatically push me aside to save me while putting on a good show for the guests. It was a funny little bit that Lacey had surely only agreed to because she got the chance to shove me down and complete a wedding ritual with my husband in front of everyone. She laughed as cake dripped down her face, scooping a glob from her cheek and smearing it onto Nick's nose. He chuckled, playfully pulling her close and smearing more icing on her face in the process. The scene was interrupted by a loud creak and groan from above the table. We all looked up just in time to see a puff of smoke rise from the Grim Reaper, and then his scythe suddenly swung down, glinting in the light. It sliced cleanly through the cake, the table, and the two people standing directly in front of it during the malfunction. I met Nick's eyes as blood blossomed from a deep cut running from his shoulder to his navel. He opened his mouth, wordless, and blood poured out. Then he collapsed on top of Lacey, whose slashed body was already lying on the floor next to the collapsed table and smashed cake, her blood now mingling with the strawberry filling. For a moment, no one moved. Then, my piercing scream shattered the silence and the event descended into chaos. I arrived back at my apartment many hours later, wedding dress covered in now dry blood and mascara streaked from crying. I closed the door behind me and locked it. I had insisted that no one come back with me, said that I needed space. Finally alone, I began stripping off my soiled clothing and dropping it in a pile on the floor. As I stepped out of my dress, my carefully maintained composure finally cracked, and I collapsed to the ground, tears running down my face. I was laughing so hard, I thought I might choke. I managed to suck in a breath, calming myself. Everything had gone perfectly, better even than I had planned. I hadn't been sure I would get Lacey, too. I had only dared to hope that she would get a front row seat as Dominic was bisected in front of her eyes. That she had been caught in the swing of my beautiful Reaper was more perfect than I could have hoped for. And since her shoving me away at the last moment had seemed spontaneous, no one would suspect a thing. If they didn't think it was an accident, surely they would think I was the intended target along with Dominic, as the woman who is meant to be standing there with him. I had already dropped my cell phone in a river on my way home, so no one would be able to find the program I used to remotely control the Reaper. No one would ever tie me to the crime now. It was true, what they said about weddings. This really was the happiest day of my life. I got to my feet and walked into the kitchen, deciding that a celebration was in order. I was just about to open the fridge when I happened to spy the wrapped box on the kitchen table. With a smile, I pulled off the card. It read, "To my one true love, here's to many happy years together. Nick." I rolled my eyes as I unwrapped it, revealing a finely carved wooden box containing a bottle of single malt scotch worth about $1,000. That was a surprise. I had always thought that Nick was too cheap to splurge on the finer things. I plucked the bottle from the box and cracked it open. Even if it was from him, I could never resist such a fine present, and it seemed fitting to toast our beautiful wedding with my late husband's last gift to me. I poured myself a glass and collapsed on the sofa. It had been a stressful day after all. Everything had been planned meticulously, but pulling off the perfect wedding still took a lot of work. I swirled the glass gently, inhaling and appreciating the delicate aroma and taste of truly good whiskey. It took a moment before I noticed that there was a strange scent in the mix that I couldn't quite place. It didn't seem to belong to the complex flavor profile of the whiskey. It seemed almost like bitter almonds. I picked up the cork from the table. Squinting at it, I found a tiny puncture mark. The realization hit me as I felt my chest tighten, breath catching in my throat. I jumped up from the couch and retrieved my purse from the floor, rifling through its contents, looking for my phone to call 911, but it wasn't there. I was sure I had put it there. Frantic, I dumped the contents, checking one last time, but it was gone. Finally, I remembered that I had already ditched it to avoid the police searching it or using it as evidence. We didn't have a landline. Who did these days? I had tried to push myself to my feet, to go out and find a neighbor who could call an ambulance, but my vision was already beginning to tunnel in. The last thing I remembered, before everything went dark, was the clock above the door. It was 11:59 on All Hallows Eve. The end of the best day of my life. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening to this narration. I just wanted to give a quick thank you to all of my patrons who are subscribed over at my Patreon,
We have a great big thank you from me to you, Alonzo, Kozak, Icy Narrates, Jesse Hartley, Andreas Anderson Linden, and Geek Sanctuary. Thank you guys so much for supporting me. If you would like to support too, just check out the links in my description. And thank you again for listening. I hope to see you all in the next video. Bye bye.